Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to do a deep dive on how the 2024 U.S. presidential election might impact India. It's a close race. We've got Vice President Kamala Harris on the Democrat side, and former President Donald Trump representing the Republicans, and it really could go either way. So
Right.
we're going to focus on the potential economic impact on India, because, well, let's face it, the U.S. economy sneezes and the rest of the world catches a cold, right?
Yeah, for sure. What happens over there definitely has ripple effects across the globe,
Yeah.
especially coming from an economic powerhouse like the U.S.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to guide us through all of this, we've got this really in-depth report from PhillipCapital. They've really done a deep dive into the policy differences between Harris and Trump and how those differences might play out in various sectors of the Indian economy.
Yeah, the report is really fascinating. It lays out all the key differences between the candidates, which
Right.
is a great starting point for understanding the potential impact on India.
Okay, so let's jump right in. First up, the economy and taxes. Seems like the Democrats, with Harris, were all about trying to help everyday folks. Reduce food costs, help people buy homes. But that means they're probably going to have to look at raising corporate taxes.
Right. And then on the other side, you've got Trump and the Republicans. They're sticking to their usual approach, lower corporate taxes and a big focus on keeping inflation under control. But but here's where it gets interesting. The report mentions that Trump might actually challenge the independence of the Federal Reserve and potentially even replace the current chair.
Wow, that's a big deal. I mean, the Fed is supposed to be independent for a reason, to keep politics out of monetary policy.
Exactly. And a move like that wouldn't just affect the U.S., it could have major global economic consequences.
Yikes. Okay, so let's move on to another big area, trade, particularly with China. Now, one thing that both parties seem to agree on is that they want to reduce trade with China.
Yeah, there's a growing consensus on both sides of the aisle that relying so heavily on China for manufacturing and trade, well, it's not really in the best interest of the U.S.
Right. And this is where India could really stand to benefit. As the U.S. looks for alternative partners, India is in a prime position to step up.
Absolutely. India's got a large, skilled workforce, a growing consumer market, and they're strategically located in the Indo-Pacific region. It's a win-win for both countries.
Makes sense. But hold on, we can't forget about Trump and his history with tariffs. He loves those tariffs, especially on China.
Yeah, that's true. If he comes back in and goes back to that kind of aggressive approach,
Hmm.
I could really shake things up in terms of global trade. We might even see the emergence of these new trade blocs.
Interesting. Okay, so a lot of potential for disruption on the trade front, regardless of who wins. Now let's shift gears and talk about energy and defense. The Democrats, with Harris, are all about clean energy. Solar, wind, you name it. But the Republicans, with Trump, are sticking with oil and gas.
Yeah, it's that classic clash of ideologies, the future of energy versus those traditional sources. And this is one area where the election outcome could have big implications for India.
For sure, like if Harris wins and the U.S. invests heavily in renewables, that could create huge opportunities for Indian companies that specialize in those technologies. They could become major suppliers in the global clean energy market.
Right. On the other hand, if Trump wins and the U.S. increases its oil and gas production, well, that could actually benefit Indian refiners and consumers. Increased U.S. production might lead to lower global oil prices, which would make it cheaper for India to import oil.
Right, because even though India is pushing for cleaner energy, they still rely heavily on oil imports. So lower oil prices would be a big help.
Exactly. And the report also suggests that under a Trump presidency, India might be able to secure more long-term gas contracts with the U.S., which would boost their energy security even further.
Okay, so the energy picture is pretty complex, with potential benefits and challenges for India, depending on how the election shakes out. Now, what about defense? Both parties seem committed to increasing defense spending. But are there any big differences in their approach?
Well, both Harris and Trump see India as a crucial partner, especially when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, as a way to counter China's growing influence. So regardless of who wins, we can probably expect to see continued defense cooperation between the U.S. and India.
Right. But I'm guessing there might be some nuances in how they approach that cooperation.
Oh, absolutely. Harris is likely to continue the Biden administration's focus on strengthening alliances, so working closely with India on things like maritime security, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, more of a collaborative approach, building a network of like-minded countries.
I see. And Trump.
With Trump, we might see a more transactional approach, prioritizing arms sales to India and focusing on specific strategic objectives like containing China's military expansion. It'll be more about deal making and protecting America's interests.
Okay, so the goal of strengthening the U.S.-India defense partnership might be the same. But the tactics and the tone could be quite different depending on who's in the White House.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good reminder that personalities and leadership styles can have a real impact on international relations.
All right, let's move on to an issue that I think a lot of people are concerned about. Immigration and onshoring, bringing jobs back to the U.S. And this is another area where both parties seem to be on the same page. They both support stricter immigration rules and policies aimed at boosting domestic manufacturing.
Right. There's a feeling on both sides that the U.S. needs to be less reliant on other countries, especially for those critical goods and services. And that means bringing those jobs back home.
Okay, but how could this impact India, especially considering their deep ties with the U.S. economy?
That's where things get interesting. On the surface, these policies might seem like they could hurt India, especially in sectors like IT, where a lot of Indian companies rely on sending skilled workers to the U.S.
Right. The H-1B visas, all of that.
Mhm.
If those visas become harder to get, that could be a problem for Indian IT firms.
True. But the thing is, Indian IT companies are incredibly adaptable. They've kind of seen this coming for a while now, and they've been quietly but strategically preparing for this shift towards stricter immigration and onshoring.
So they're not just sitting back and waiting to see what happens.
No way. They've got some pretty clever strategies in place to mitigate the risks.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, one of their main strategies is to hire more local talent in the U.S., so they're less reliant on those work visas. They're investing in training programs, upskilling American workers, and actively recruiting from U.S. universities.
That makes sense. If you
Yeah.
can't bring in as many workers from India, you got to find qualified people locally.
Exactly. And then another strategy they're using is to increase their reliance on subcontractors. These subcontractors often already have the necessary work permits, and they can seamlessly integrate into those projects.
Ah, so it's like outsourcing within outsourcing.
Pretty much. And their third strategy is to set up what they call near-shore delivery centers. These are centers that are located in countries like Mexico and Canada, which are closer to the U.S. and have more favorable time zones for collaboration.
Smart. So instead of having everyone in India working remotely, they're setting up shop closer to their clients.
Right. It's all about adapting to the changing landscape and finding creative solutions. And this brings us to the report's analysis of how specific sectors in India might be affected, which we'll dive into in more detail in part 2.
Okay, so we've set the stage, talked about those big policy differences between Harris and Trump and how they might impact India. But let's zoom in a little bit now, get into the nitty-gritty of how specific sectors in India might fare, depending on who takes the White House.
Sounds good to me.
Let's start with the IT sector. We
Mhm.
talked about how it could face some challenges with potential changes in U.S. immigration policy and this push for onshoring.
Right.
But you mentioned that Indian IT companies are pretty adaptable. They're
Mhm.
not just going to sit back and watch things happen.
No, they're not. They're being proactive.
So what are they doing? What are some of those strategies they're using to adapt?
Well, one of the big ones is hiring more local talent right here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Reducing their dependence on those work visas, like, for example, Infosys. They've been investing a lot in training programs for U.S. workers, upskilling them in all the latest technologies, and they're also actively recruiting from American universities.
Interesting. So it's not just about bringing in fewer workers from India. It's also about building a more diverse workforce here in the U.S.
Exactly. It shows that they're committed to the U.S. market, that they're willing to invest in American workers, and it helps them navigate those potential visa restrictions.
Smart. What other strategies are they using?
Another one is increased reliance on subcontractors. So basically, instead of directly employing all the workers themselves, they're partnering with smaller, more specialized firms
Hmm.
that already have the necessary work permits and can handle parts of a project.
So it's like outsourcing within outsourcing.
Yeah.
And it gives them more
Well, 'cause
flexibility. What else?
Well, the third big strategy is setting up what are called near-shore delivery centers. So instead of having everyone in India working remotely, they're establishing these centers in countries like Mexico and Canada, which are closer to their U.S. clients and have more favorable time zones.
Makes sense. Easier to collaborate when you're in the same time zone.
Exactly.
So even though a Trump victory might present some challenges for the Indian IT sector, it's not necessarily doom and gloom.
Nope. They're adaptable. They're finding ways to adjust.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the auto industry. This is where things get a little more complicated, right? Because depending on who wins, the future of the U.S. auto industry could look very different.
Yeah, it could. And that could have a ripple effect on Indian auto suppliers. Like, take companies like Sona BLW and SAML. They're big players in the electric vehicle components market, supplying everything from motors and axles to battery management systems.
So they're riding the EV wave.
They are.
But if Trump wins, he might not be as supportive of the EV industry as Biden has been.
That's a possibility.
So that could hurt the demand for EV components from these Indian suppliers.
Yeah, at least in the short term. But here's the thing. A slowdown in EV adoption in the U.S. might actually benefit hybrid vehicles.
Yeah.
You know, those vehicles that combine a gasoline engine with an electric motor.
Right, hybrids.
And guess what? Indian companies are well positioned to supply components for both EVs and hybrids.
So they've got their bases covered.
They do.
Not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Smart move.
Now, what about the other side of the auto industry, the more traditional side?
Well, there's actually a potential benefit there for Indian auto manufacturers too, particularly for companies like Fraught Forge and RK Forgings. They make high-quality components for heavy-duty trucks.
No.
And remember how Trump is all about infrastructure. If he wins and pushes through those big infrastructure projects, the demand for heavy-duty trucks is going to go way up.
To transport all those construction materials and equipment.
Exactly. And that means more business for the companies that supply the parts for those trucks.
Including Indian companies.
Ex-
So it's like a domino effect.
It is.
One policy decision can trigger a whole chain of events.
And create opportunities in unexpected places.
All right, let's talk about energy. Harris and Trump have very different visions for America's energy future.
Very different.
Harris is all about clean energy. Solar, wind, hydro, you name it. She wants to transition the U.S. away from fossil fuels.
And Trump is sticking with those fossil fuels, encouraging oil and gas drilling, even talking about bringing back coal.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast. And this is one area where the election outcome could have a huge impact on India, which, as we know, is a major energy consumer and importer.
Absolutely.
So let's break it down. How would a Harris victory affect India's energy landscape?
Well, if Harris wins and the U.S. really goes all in on renewable energy, it could create some interesting opportunities for India. India has huge potential for solar energy, and they've already made some good progress in developing their solar industry.
Right, they've got those massive solar farms popping up all over the place.
Exactly. And if the U.S. is serious about that clean energy transition, they're going to need partners. They're going to need suppliers. And India could become a major player in that global clean energy market.
So a Harris presidency could actually help accelerate India's own clean energy transition.
It's possible, but there could also be challenges. Harris's focus on human rights and democratic values, well, that could lead to more scrutiny of India's domestic policies.
Right. There have been concerns about freedom of speech, religious freedom in India.
Exactly.
Okay, so a Harris win presents both opportunities and potential challenges for India on the energy front. What about Trump? How would his approach to energy affect India?
Well, if Trump wins and the U.S. sticks with fossil fuels, it could actually have some benefits for India. Like we talked about earlier, if the U.S. ramps up oil and gas production, it could lead to lower global crude oil prices.
Which would be good news for India.
It would.
Lower oil prices means lower energy costs for Indian consumers and businesses.
Exactly. And it could also mean that India could secure more long-term gas contracts with the U.S.
So a Trump victory could strengthen India's energy security.
That's one way to look at it. But of course, we can't ignore the environmental concerns with continued reliance on fossil fuels.
Right, it's a trade-off.
It is.
Okay, let's move on to commodities and metals. How could those be affected by the election?
Well, this is where Trump's whole Make America Great Again agenda could really come into play. Remember, he's big on infrastructure spending. If he wins, we could see a massive investment in roads, bridges, airports, all that stuff.
And all those infrastructure projects require a lot of raw materials. Steel, aluminum, copper.
You got it.
And India is a major producer of many of those metals.
Exactly.
So increased demand for metals in the U.S. could be a big win for Indian mining companies.
It could. And there's historical precedent for this. Commodity prices went up quite a bit during Trump's first term.
Interesting. So if history repeats itself, Indian companies in the metals and mining sector could do very well if Trump returns to the White House.
It's definitely a possibility.
Okay, let's move on to pharmaceuticals. This is an area where India has a really strong global presence.
Yeah, they do.
But it's also an area where things get a little tricky.
How so?
Well, both Harris and Trump have talked about lowering healthcare costs in the U.S.
Right.
And that could create some challenges for Indian pharmaceutical companies.
Because lowering healthcare costs often means putting pressure on drug prices.
And that could squeeze profit margins for Indian generic drug manufacturers.
It could. They rely heavily on the U.S. market.
Right. India is known for producing those affordable generic drugs.
Exactly.
So if drug prices in the U.S. go down, that could hurt Indian companies.
It's a possibility. But the report suggests that the overall volume of pharmaceutical exports from India to the U.S., well, that's likely to remain pretty stable.
So even if prices go down, they might be able to make up for it by selling more drugs.
Potentially.
Okay, so the pharmaceutical sector faces some uncertainty, but it's not necessarily a dire situation.
Right.
Now, we've talked about IT, autos, energy, metals, and pharmaceuticals. What about some of those other industries that are often mentioned when we talk about U.S.-India trade? Like textiles, auto components, consumer electronics.
Yeah, those are all areas where India has been working to increase their exports to the U.S.
So how might the election impact those efforts?
Well, remember how we talked about Trump's love of tariffs?
Oh yeah, especially when it comes to China.
Right. So if he wins and he slaps tariffs on Chinese goods, it could actually create a big opportunity for Indian companies in those sectors. American businesses are going to be looking for alternative suppliers because those Chinese goods are suddenly more expensive.
And India could step in.
Exactly.
It's like a game of musical chairs.
It is.
When one player gets out, everyone else scrambles for a seat.
And India is well positioned to grab one of those seats.
So a Trump victory, with those potential tariffs on China, could actually create a more favorable environment for Indian exports in these other sectors.
It's one of those unintended consequences.
Interesting. It seems like no matter who wins, there are going to be both winners and losers in India's economic landscape.
It's true.
But one thing's for sure, India is a rising economic power.
There's no doubt about that.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more area I want to touch on. Defense. How could the election outcome affect the U.S.-India defense relationship?
Well, like we discussed earlier, both Harris and Trump see India as a key partner in the Indo-Pacific. They both recognize India's importance in countering China's influence.
So, regardless of who wins, the U.S. is going to continue strengthening its defense ties with India.
It seems that way. There seems to be bipartisan support for that.
But I'm guessing there might be some differences in how they approach that relationship.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, what kind of differences are we talking about?
Well, Harris, as a Democrat, is likely to continue the Biden administration's approach, which is all about deeper defense cooperation, joint military exercises, technology sharing, maybe even co-production of defense equipment.
So building a more integrated partnership. And that aligns with the broader democratic approach to foreign policy.
Right. Working closely with allies, multilateralism, all of that.
In Trump.
Trump might focus more on arms sales and specific strategic objectives. He might be less interested in those deep multilateral partnerships and more interested in securing those concrete deals that benefit the U.S.
So less about collaboration, more about each country pursuing its own interests.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And there's another factor to consider here. India's relationship with Russia.
Right. They have a long history of close ties.
And that could become a point of friction in the U.S.-India relationship.
Especially if Harris wins.
Because the Democrats tend to be tougher on Russia than the Republicans.
Yeah. And if Harris tries to pressure India to distance itself from Russia, it could create some tension.
So the U.S.-India defense relationship, while strong overall, could be affected by these broader geopolitical dynamics.
Oh, sure.
It's a reminder that these bilateral relationships don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by all sorts of global factors.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, looking at how the U.S. election might impact India's various sectors and its defense relationship.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has, and I think we've highlighted some important nuances and potential opportunities,
Yeah.
things that might not be immediately apparent.
I agree. And it's a reminder that the U.S. election isn't just an American event. It has implications for countries all over the world, and India is definitely no exception.
Welcome back to our deep dive on the U.S. election and its impact on India. We've looked at so many different angles, from taxes and trade to energy and defense, really digging into how specific industries in India might be affected.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey, hasn't it? And what's clear is that there's no simple answer, no guaranteed winner or loser.
Exactly. So let's zoom out a bit now and think big picture. What does all of this mean for India, regardless of who wins, Harris or Trump?
Well, one thing that really jumps out from the PhillipCapital report is this idea that India is probably going to benefit from the U.S. taking a harder line on China.
So that's something both Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on.
Yeah, it seems so. Both parties are worried about China's economic and military power, and they see India as a key player in countering that.
So for India, this rivalry between the U.S. and China could actually be a good thing.
It could be. It's a chance for India to become even more important on the global stage.
But what are some of the risks for India, even with this opportunity?
Well, one risk is that India gets caught in the middle of this U.S.-China rivalry. If things escalate, India might be pressured to choose sides.
And that wouldn't be good. India has always tried to balance its relationships with big powers.
Exactly. Another risk is that the U.S., whether it's Harris or Trump, might not actually come through on all of its promises to India.
So India needs to be careful, not depend too much on any one country.
Right. It's all about having options and staying independent.
Okay, let's get into specifics about each candidate. We talked about those sector-specific impacts, but what about the broader picture?
Well, if Harris wins, we'll probably see a lot of the current policies continue. So, a focus on alliances, promoting democracy, and tackling climate change.
And how might that affect India?
Well, there could be a lot more cooperation on climate change. India has made big promises to cut emissions, even though it's still developing and needs a lot of energy.
Right, they've invested a lot in solar energy and electric vehicles.
Exactly. So a Harris administration might be more willing to work with India on this, with financial help and technology, and that could open up new markets for Indian companies focused on green tech.
So a win for Harris could help India become a cleaner, greener economy.
It's possible, but there could be some bumps in the road. Harris is big on human rights and democracy, which could lead to more scrutiny of some of India's domestic policies.
Okay, so a Harris win has pros and cons for India.
Mm.
What about if Trump wins? We've talked about his America First approach and all those tariffs. How might that play out?
Yeah, his protectionist policies could make things tough for Indian companies trying to export to the U.S., at least in the short term. We talked about how those tariffs on China might help India in some areas, but there's a chance those tariffs could expand to other countries.
So it's a bit of a gamble for India.
Yeah, for sure. But there's also a chance that Trump, who loves making deals, could strike a good trade agreement with India.
So with Trump, it's hard to say for sure what will happen with trade. It could be great for India, or it could be bad.
Exactly. And there's another thing to consider, Russia. Trump seems to like Putin, and he hasn't been too happy with NATO and those old alliances.
How could that affect India, which is close with Russia?
Well, if Trump wins, he might ease up on Russia. And that would give India more freedom to stay close to Russia without upsetting the U.S.
So Trump might give India more room to maneuver in its foreign policy.
It's possible, but there are also risks with a U.S. foreign policy that's less predictable.
Right, it could make things less stable around the world, which wouldn't be good for anyone. Before we wrap up, there's this really interesting bit from the report. They looked at how U.S. and Indian stock markets have done under different presidents.
Oh, yeah, they wanted to see if there was a link between who was in the White House and how well the markets did.
What did they find?
It turns out that both markets, U.S. and Indian, have generally done well under both Democrats and Republicans. There's no clear pattern.
So historically, it hasn't really mattered who's president.
It seems that way. Of course, other things can affect the markets, like the global economy and interest rates, but who's in the White House doesn't seem to be the deciding factor.
That's good to know, especially with all the uncertainty around this election.
Yeah, it's a reminder that markets can often weather those political storms.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've really explored how the U.S. election might play out in India, but as with any complex topic, it's just the start of the conversation.
I agree. And it highlights how important it is to stay informed, think critically, and be ready to adapt.
Absolutely. To wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a question. Based on something the report predicted, they said a Trump presidency could lead to new trade blocs forming, with countries changing their economic alliances.
That was a really interesting idea.
So here's the question. How might those new trade blocs take shape? And what role could India play? Could India, with its growing economy and strategic location, be at the center of a new global economic order, bridging the gap between East and West?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. It makes you think about the big picture and the long-term impact of this election, not just for the U.S. and India, but for the whole world.
Exactly, because this election is about more than just who sits in the Oval Office. It's about the future direction of the world. And India, with all its potential, is ready to play a major part in shaping that future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.